Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 53rd edition of Data Bites, hosted by Public Digital. I'm Gavin Freeguard, and it's wonderful to see so many of you this evening here at Broadway House and online. Let's start in the usual way. Hands up if you've been to Data Bites before. Welcome back. Hands up if this is your first Data Bites. Welcome. Now, you've made an excellent life choice tonight, coming to Data Bites to hear 4 fantastic presenters. I'm slightly regretting the one I made, which was to kick these things off trying to be funny about current affairs. My own petard, it is so hoist. Now, I started last month's event with the doomsday clock and how humanity had never been closer to destruction, which looks positively optimistic at this point. So I'm afraid you may have to endure some depressing data before we get to our brilliant speakers, but I promise I will end with an uplifting chart. Relatively speaking. Let's start with some non-depressing housekeeping. We are on the record and are being live streamed, obviously. If you're on social media, the hashtag is PDDataBites, and you can put your questions to our speakers via Slido, bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. If you're here in the room, you can, of course, raise your hand as well. What does DataBites do? We aim to put good work involving data on the record so we can all learn from it, provide a space for the different data communities in and around government to come together, and bring to life what better data can do for all of us, whether we think of ourselves as data people or not. How does Data Bites work? This evening, you're going to be treated to 4 presentations on interesting data projects. Each of our speakers will have 8 minutes to present. Yes, just 8 minutes. There are 8 bits in a byte, hence 8 minutes in a data byte. Each speaker will then take questions for 8 minutes. Yes, just 8 minutes. And then we move on to the next speaker. So 4 presentations of 8 minutes, each followed by questions for 8 minutes. You can watch the previous 3 Data Bites at Public Digital, including last month's, at bit.ly/pddatabytes, all lowercase. The 49 before that were hosted by the Institute for Government. You can watch those at bit.ly/ifgdatabytes, capital IFGDB. They include a couple of tonight's speakers. Elliot at DataBytes 39 in March 2023, and Andy at DataBytes 3 way back in June 2019. Now you'll see Andy has a habit of being photographed in front of good slogans like everything runs on Excel, though I think this one might be my favourite. Very relatable. Now, what's happened since we last met? Here comes the depressing bit. Well, I'm going to start with 2 significant anniversaries. First, we've just passed the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And whatever the tantrum-prone toddler in the White House may think, a majority of Brits think President Zelensky is doing a good job, 60%. The same number are unfavourable to Donald Trump, and that was before the events of last week. Second, we're nearly at the 5th anniversary of the first COVID lockdown. There are some words you may not have heard in a while. Now, back in January 2021, 3/4 of the UK population said they could explain what the R number was. How many of you reckon you still could? Let's see some hands in the air. I thought you might be able to. And if I told you I wasn't going to pick on any of you in the audience, how many of you could confidently explain the R number? Yeah, a lot more. I thought it might be. Now, it's how many people an infected person would infect on average. Now, here are some data points I found writing a long read on R for Understanding Patient Data and the Royal Statistical Society. This is from The Atlantic magazine when they realised the US government was using their data. They note that government plans had a lot to say about data, but largely assumed that data would simply exist. Nobody had really thought about how the data would be collected, created, or transmitted. It was similar in the UK. Death data started as individual emails about individual patients. Decision makers across the UK were relying on emails, phone calls, random Excel spreadsheets, even Word documents for basic data. The industry and ingenuity of public servants cut through that, giving us usable information and some great things like the COVID-19 dashboard. But we need to make sure we're better prepared for any future pandemic. I told you it was going to be depressing, didn't I? Now, returning to this month, let's start with our old friend, the ministerial resignations chart. If we zoom in, we'll see there have been two since we last met. One you'll have no doubt seen, that was International Development Minister Annalisa Dodds quitting over aid cuts, and one you probably haven't, which was Lord Cryer resigning as a whip. As we'll soon see, those weren't the only ministerial departures this month. Here's a different version of the resignations chart. The big circles show cabinet departures outside reshuffles, the smaller ones are junior ministers. We originally thought this chart would work really well, until we got to Theresa May, and then Boris Johnson. But it does allow us to highlight ministers who've been sacked as well as those who've resigned, such as Andrew Gwynn, sacked over WhatsApp messages a few weeks ago. If we look at all of the ministers sacked outside reshuffle since 1979, it's probably fewer than you think, though there have been more in recent years, and there should frankly have been even more than that. Now, speaking of departures, DSIT Perm Sec Sarah Munby announced she'll be leaving her role soon. But today I wanted to look at another of the leadership roles in the digital centre, an old DataBytes favourite, the Government Chief Data Officer. Now, back in 2015, Mike Bracken, now of this parish, was appointed CDO, then left government 6 months later. In 2017, government failed to appoint a new CDO, then again in 2019. The National Data Strategy promised one in 2020. In January 2021, there were some other big digital government appointments, but no Chief Data Officer. In February 2021, some idiot even wrote a sea shanty about the lack of a Chief Data Officer. Then 3 years later, just 3 years later, #impact. A government Chief Data Officer was appointed, finally. He even spoke at DataBytes back in November. And then he quit. Which makes for quite a stark chart. Now, I did promise you a relatively optimistic chart to finish. Now, last month, we debuted this chart showing how far we are through Trump's presidency. It's like one of those fundraising charts you find for a village hall or a church roof or a G7 economy. Now, the good news is we're now more than 3% of the way through the Trump presidency. But a friend pointed out to me I wasn't counting his first term, so actually, when you think about it, we're more than halfway through President Trump. And that's as positive as I can make the news this month. Now, I'm more optimistic about tonight's speakers. We'll actually kick off at the Digital Centre with Duncan Brown from the Incubator for Artificial Intelligence on AI and Data Federation. Our second speaker, for his second DataBytes, is Elliot Bridges from the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority on the HFEA Dashboard. Our third speaker is Public Digital's very own Amanda Smith, who will present on data service standards. And our final speaker this evening, also for his second DataBytes, is Full Facts' Andy Dudfield on making facts part of the web. The next DataBytes will be on Thursday, the 3rd of April, and we have dates for your diary all the way through to the summer. If you work for a public sector organisation and would like to speak or know someone who should, come and speak to me afterwards or email events@public.digital. And today is Ash Wednesday. For Lent, why not give up keeping DataBytes to yourself? We'd love to grow this wonderful... I didn't think that would get the biggest laugh, but thank you. More Lent jokes, I'll bear that one in mind. We would love to grow this wonderful community even further, so why not tell a friend, especially if they work in the public sector, or share something you hear tonight on social media. There'll also be video, audio and slides available for you to share in the next few days. That's more than enough from me, so I'm going to welcome our first speaker to the lectern, and that's Duncan.
Can I get some water before the clock's...
You can indeed.
I'm just going to go behind this little screen. Right. I'm still mic'd up, aren't I? You can hear me.
We can. But it's okay, your water pouring is not counting against your time.
My time it's not going to be as good as yours, Gavin. Just lower your expectations, please. Right. I don't have anywhere to put this now, do I? Do you want to start how do I start the clock?
We'll start it.
Okay, great. I'm Duncan Brown. I'm a software engineer, and I'm the head of software engineering at i.AI. These are my views, not i.AI's. And I'd just like to present an idea. As many of you will know, Richard Pope has written this excellent book, Platformland, which is a vision for how bits of the digital state could interoperate. In Platformland, small, salient facts are shared between services. For example, credentials of ownership or status, the idea being that services can coordinate and services can become proactive, eliminating these whole categories of bureaucracy. Platformland strongly implies a federated approach to data sharing. Federated because this is fundamentally a distributed system. It must be based on standards because how else could federation work? Those standards must be open because they will need to evolve and be held in common. And finally, it must be developed plank by plank against concrete specific needs because that's the only way to build good software. And that means you need not build a totalizing monoculture of data collection and data sharing via some kind of centrally planned mega project. Next to Platformland on my bookshelf is this brilliant paper about the National Data Library. Ben Goldacre and colleagues wrote this in response to a call for proposals about how the library could be built. Funnily enough, they make a strong case that the National Data Library needs to be a federation of data providers, built on open standards, and at least at first, case by case, according to concrete needs. Obviously, these two visions are compatible. One is transactional, one analytical, but they both run on distributed facts, so they both have very similar dependencies. And the reason I'm standing here now is because whilst I think it is conceivable that we deliver one radical transformation to the way we share facts over the next 10 years or so, it's even more conceivable that we deliver two, and they turn out to be incompatible. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult, it turns out, to have strategic conversations about large systems that don't exist yet. In a report on the National Data Library, the Tony Blair Institute nods at Ben Goldacre's and other proposals for a federated discovery-led approach. But it struck me as odd that the first recommendation of the powerful voices in this report is to set up multiple layers of governance with reporting lines to the Prime Minister himself. In the hope of a brighter federated future, which is the critical dependency in realizing some of these benefits, I want to put a small, slightly chaotic thumb on the scales on the side of practice rather than governance. And I want to do that by throwing generative AI into it, hopefully not in the way you might expect. One of my favorite quotes about AI comes from Cory Doctorow from December 2023. An AI that helps radiologists by giving a second opinion, he writes, might help them find tumors on X-rays, but that's a tool that reduces the number of scans a radiologist processes in a shift by making them go back and reconsider the scans they've already processed. But AI's sales pitch, he goes on, is not buy an AI tool and increase your costs while increasing your accuracy. The pitch for AI is buy an AI and save money by firing workers. This is definitely savage, but it's also definitely not proven wrong yet, even though it's been a while. And you could take it even further. If the AI savings argument falls apart in a snowstorm of lawsuits and/or extremely onerous oversight practices, if it turns out that you need so much human in the loop that getting equivalent performance actually costs more than it did before, at that point you might start asking yourself questions like, well, I'm going to spend some money anyway. Do I want to send it to California to spend on power stations and GPUs, or shall I keep it here and hire Sid? Sid, after all, is a person. So I'm not surprised that a slim majority of people turn out to be neutral or negative on the impact of AI both on society or themselves. There will not definitely be a killer app. Indeed, there are signs that the models might be getting cleverer without getting much more reliable. And in the case of GPT 4.5, which came out very recently, much, much more expensive to boot. But it's a shame to waste a good crisis, and in the absence of a crisis, a good hype cycle will do. And right now we're at the crest of the greatest, the goldenest, the $500 billion-est hype cycle the world has ever seen. So my question is, can we take the money and the energy and the curiosity that is driving the frankly remarkable, when you think about it, proportions of people on the positive side of that chart, and tastefully divert some of it into boring old data sharing, maybe with some AI benefits? If there's one thing I've learned over the last year being involved with teams across governments, with panels and courses and Q&As and talks, it's that people are deeply curious about AI. They want to work with it, or I should say, they want to play with it at work. So to go back to the start, one, to do good cross-cutting work in government, whether transactional or analytical, whether AI is involved or not, we require an open, diverse ecosystem for information sharing. Two, to have that, we must work on interoperability via open standards. The only way to develop those is in the open and to test them in the fires of production as early and as often as possible. And 3, political will to invest in AI is roughly aligned with teams' will to engage with it. So the question is, what would it look like to enable broad participation in AI at the same time as supporting the evolution of a data sharing ecosystem, and I guess the evolution of its governance? Here is a proposal. You have to accept something a bit strange to begin with, and I'm not sure this is good, but it is an idea, which is that the easiest form of data to share is text, specifically text in the public domain. AI makes it possible to compute on free text, and text is schemaless. Public domain does not mean useless. There are operational teams and support teams across government, and indeed across the whole public sector, whose work is to understand, corral, and communicate guidance from mostly public corpuses, mostly hosted on Gov.uk, but also elsewhere. And I believe we underrate the work of curation that goes into constructing the sets of documents that these teams use. We could give teams the means to curate their texts, first on a central platform. Perhaps you could run periodic web scrapers for them, or plug into their SharePoints or whatever it is. And then, out of that platform, offer interfaces for that text. Get the whole thing, maybe, or do semantic search on them, but crucially provide this information in a standard API which AI capabilities can consume. Perhaps your capability is a chatbot. Perhaps it's structuring every document in your corpus according to a JSON schema. Perhaps it's reading all your public documentation and pointing out all the redundancies and contradictions in it. But it is doing this over a standardized interface. Tools support multiple datasets support multiple tools, and of course the price of entry for this is adopting the standard, either as a tool or a dataset. Eventually you get authentication, and eventually you can do away with the platform because you have standards, and so you have an ecosystem. And then at some point, we can start on the numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and in time as well. Do take a seat,
Thank you.
and we will come to the audience for questions. If you're watching us online, you're probably already on Slido where you can submit questions. If you're not, it's bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. You're welcome to use that in the room as well. But you can also put your hand up. Do tell us who you are if you can and where you're from, but remember we are on the record. Please wait for the mic, and please do keep your questions short as the timer will start with the first question. I'll come to the room first, and we've got one right down at the front.
Thank you. Paul Atherton, Fellow at the Royal Society of Arts. I'm really interested in how you see the collaboration of kind of open source and GitHub and all the rest of it in environments which have always tended to be proprietary and inordinately protective.
Mm-hmm. I think government has really struggled with this because of the way that procurement works. I think the power of effective salespeople is so much more kind of like immediate than the power of long-term investment in technology. And I think one of the greatest and most revolutionary things that GDS did was to bring open source really into the mainstream and into the center and heart of government practice. So that's definitely been beneficial. But especially now, you know, the salespeople are back with a vengeance, and I think it's really important to keep on fighting that fight.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go online for the next one. This question is from Tom King. Good evening to you, Tom, and apologies, I think I owe you an email. Tom's question is, what does leadership look like in a federated or distributed data approach?
Okay, I love this question because I feel like you don't get to ask these questions until you begin. And I think that what the danger is always with these things is that we legislate up front and we end up tying ourselves in knots over things that aren't kind of really ready to be, you know, for that treatment. So I think you can look at examples of how it's worked in different ecosystems, but I wouldn't want to say, you know, if UK government this would or wouldn't work. So if I have a moment to think about different sort of open source ecosystems, you can probably think of 3 or 4 different models where software has really thrived. I mean, it's all gone down the pan, but WordPress was a really interesting example of this, where you effectively had a central sort of benevolent dictator kind of organization in that case, and then you had this really, really fertile ecosystem of people contributing to it, and also sort of taking the contributions and putting them into practice in interesting ways. That's gone to pot, which is an interesting kind of ending to that story, where effectively the dictator kind of lost his head. and now they're embroiled in lawsuits and things. That's more of a sort of vague thought than an answer. Can anyone think of another good example?
Any questions or any answers to that question in the room? We've got one down at the front.
I don't have an answer to that. Claire Griffiths, Department of Health and Social Care. I was just wondering how far off you think we are from having truly interoperable data platforms across government. I have my own view, but I'd be interested in yours.
What is your view?
Years,
Yeah.
decades.
I think I agree. That's why I sort of said 10 years at the start. That feels optimistic. It feels like it's always going to be a mixture, doesn't it? It's going to be, some things are going to be worked on and they'll be working well, and some things will inevitably be left by the wayside. We do have some basic ground floor bureaucracy in the world. We have forms, we have the postal service. We have websites. Standards have, like, really, really rigid bedrock standards have come out, but they've taken ages, and they're also general enough to be adopted in that way. And actually what we need in government is a million specific things, and maybe pull out some generalities from that. So I don't really know. A long time.
Thanks. We've got a question at the back and then one closer to the front.
Hi, Alex Blanford, University of Oxford. Going round, there was something you mentioned there about kind of the costs of this over time, and that actually sometimes this costs more than things get sold that they'll save money, but to actually achieve quality, they cost me, and that's certainly what I think we found through digital transformation over the last 15 years. Yes. I'd be really interested in what you think. Like, you mentioned all the sort of levers of things that you need to work on there, like power and politics and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. How do you think you've combat that kind of tendency to bring this in as a stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap option, rather than something that needs deep engagement, deep thought, lots of money to get to the results you want?
I think we're grappling with that question. It is the question about AI, and I think the real growth industry to bet on right now is assurance, evaluation, lawsuits, all of the stuff that's going to go, all the processes that are going to go around these things. Like, there are broadly kind of two different things that you can do with it. There's, you can automate existing processes and make them better, or you can just discover whole new processes that you couldn't do before, like things like AI-mediated consensus finding applications and things like that are just kind of brand new, and potentially you're going to realize much greater gains in those more disruptive places, but no one actually knows how to do them or how to operate them. So it's probably safe to say that it's going to take a long time to figure out what the answer to that is. But we as government need to have the capability to have a view on it, which means basically that we need to be building stuff, and we need to not be just procuring things from those salespeople.
Thanks. We had a question 3 rows in front. Yeah.
Hi, David Duran. Alex very impressively stole my questions. So I'll do a quick statement and then a different question. So a quick statement. The GDS blueprint that came out recently talks about a lot of stuff like data normalization across government, submit every piece of data only once. There is something apparently called the government digital backbone, which is being designed at the moment, but we don't know what any of these things really are because GDS isn't talking about them in the open. So this stuff is happening, but it's all kind of, in a box somewhere. In terms of a question, since Alex stole my one, there's been a lot of stuff written in the last couple of years about developing evidence ecosystems for policy development. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people talked about that. Yes. How does that fit into the kind of use of AI you've been talking about in your presentation?
So where I am or have been in Cabinet Office, there is one of those teams, the Evaluation Task Force, and there are teams which are really trying, what works programs and things like that, and trying to figure out what's happening with this stuff. A lot of what happens in those teams is that they get a lot of qualitative information, and often the AI conversation is then, how can I fill it and structure this qualitative information in a way that's going to give me apples to apples comparisons and things like that. So there are so many moving parts to that. There's kind of getting the information out of the process, and then there's parsing the information and just figuring out what shape all this stuff needs to be. There are dashboards, that are presented to ministers on a daily basis with all kinds of hard stats on them. Whether those are the right stats to make the decisions they need to be making it's very, very hard to tell. And there is a sense in which kind of like AI, like all data products, does kind of give you this rather false sense of security in terms of knowing stuff. So we do need to reflect on policy. We do need to consult and do all those other things with it. But it's not like AI is going to solve some of those philosophical problems.
Thanks. I'm going to squeeze in a final quick online question. This is from Anonymous. Good evening to you, Anonymous. How do we prevent implementations of AI from becoming yet more legacy systems?
Yeah.
Sorry to end on that really easy.
How do we prevent? Well, we can't prevent it. We can't prevent it. We just have to live with it. One of the really fun things about AI is that the ground's always moving under you in terms of how the models kind of behave. Like if you change the hardware, you can change the behavior of the model, which is wild. So you have to like for example, you have this idea in large language models. Can I go a little bit over? Where you can set this. There's a variable called temperature, and you can set the temperature to 0, which means that theoretically the model won't be creative at all. But because of a quirk of the way that the hardware works, that actually can never be true, and you can never have a fully deterministic model. And so we've got all of this stuff shifting under our feet all the time, and even if you call the same API, you're still potentially going to get a different answer. It might be a slightly different sort of like version of the model running on different hardware. It might be a different release of the model, depending on how granularly they release. Like OpenAI offer release identifiers in their API, but I don't know how much to trust those. And the models themselves are providing these sort of like probabilistic outputs. So it's going to be all kinds of complicated to figure out how to depend on this stuff and like how to make bug complete sort of replications if that's what you need to end up doing in 10 years' time.
Great. Well, Duncan, thank you for getting us off to an extremely thought-provoking start. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our second speaker tonight is Elliot. Welcome back.
Thank you. Okay. Right. So I'm Elliot, thank you, and I'm going to talk through the HFEA Dashboard. Okay, so there we go. I'll begin with a quick introduction to the UK fertility sector. I'm aware we're a relatively niche area. So in the UK, around 1 in every 7 couples may have difficulty conceiving, and if they want to have children, they may need medical assistance with this. And so in 1990, there was the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, which established the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, where I work, the HFEA, and we regulate fertility treatment in the UK and embryo research. Part of that regulation is we collect data on every treatment which happens in a UK licensed centre, and so we now have data on around 1.6 million IVF treatments and 275,000 donor insemination treatments. Donor insemination is just another form of fertility treatment, and together these accounted for around 1 in 32 births in 2019. Okay. So what do we do with all of this data, which we collect? We do quite a bit, and one thing we'd like to do is publish the data. So we do annual trends reports covering like general trends in the area, things like how the average birth rate is changing over time and this sort of thing. We also do specific reports looking at specific areas. Our most recent one was on the changing family types having fertility treatment and this sort of thing. And we also release data on a more ad hoc basis to different groups. We provide data sets to researchers. We, as I'm sure a lot of people do, have a lot of freedom of information requests, parliamentary questions, media inquiries, requests from clinics for data, and we get a lot of ad hoc requests from other teams in our organisation and other organisations. So these more ad hoc data requests, they tend to sort of be fairly specific but follow similar themes, but not common enough themes that we could preemptively prepare the data, but with underlying themes, and so we thought that building dashboards to provide this data to people would be a good way to help with answering the data queries. So we decided to build a dashboard. We began with a stakeholder mapping exercise. So we met up and went through our various target audiences for this work, which would be clinicians, researchers, journalists, fertility patients, the general public, and our colleagues. And we went through what we thought would be the different data needs of these groups. We work with them quite regularly, most of the people on this list, so we had a pretty good idea of what they needed. We also have a number of colleagues who used to work in these areas, and so we were able to speak to them about their specific data interests. And we combined this all and we built a prototype. We then did quite a lot of user testing with this prototype. So this began internally. We gave colleagues in various teams access to the dashboard and a feedback form and let them in their own time have a play around with it and provide feedback. And we made changes based upon this. We then moved externally, so we recruited a selection of current fertility patients, and we had them sit down with our social researcher and go through guided interviews. So we gave them access to the dashboard on a call and taught them through it and asked them to pull data they thought might be interesting, and then used the process of them using the dashboard to inform how we changed it afterwards. We then arranged for reviews from a selection of figures in the sector, so we had a varied selection of researchers, professional groups, patient organisations who we again gave the access to the dashboard. We let them do things on their own. We gave them a form and they provided feedback as well. We did some work around accessibility. We commissioned a report into this to make sure that people with disabilities could use the dashboard effectively. And then finally, when we went through our senior leadership and got approval from them, and we published last year now. So the final dashboard, after all of this, ended up looking like this. So this is the homepage. You see we have the title and links to 9 different pages. They tend to follow, they cover like different treatment types, birth rates, and some more specific information. And we have a link down the bottom to a feedback form, which we do monitor, and we've made changes based on the feedback gathered after launch. We also have a link to an instructional video, which our communications team developed for people who may struggle to use it. Okay, so in terms of what these specific pages look like, they tend to follow similar themes. We tried to have a template which we stuck to as much as possible between the pages, so I'll just go into one of them. I'll just go into the IVF birth and pregnancy rates page. So this page looks like this. See, top we have a title, we have 2 cards with what we think are the most important pieces of information on the page. In this case, it's the birth rate and the pregnancy rate from IVF in the most recent year of data. We have 2 graphs, which show how these have changed over time. And we have a collection of filters people can apply down the side. So if people are only interested in birth rates from a specific kind of treatment, using donor eggs, say, in patients aged within this age group, then people can apply that and look specifically at that information. One thing we do have on this page, which we don't have on all of the pages of the dashboard, is a note at the top saying that this is not medical advice. We were very aware when we were making the dashboard that there was if this was going to be publicly available, there was a risk that people might overinterpret the data. So we felt that it was important to have that on there, and on a couple of other pages where that was a concern. Okay, so after having built the dashboard, we then went about promoting its use. So externally we did this by making an explainer video. We added a banner to our website advertising it, and we had that pink banner at the bottom of all of our emails for a long time promoting the dashboard. We did a press release, which got a lot of media coverage, including this article in The Guardian. We did social media posts, and we've publicised it in sector publications and the conferences. The Buyer News there is a trade journal, essentially, in our area. Internally, we've run training sessions for colleagues in the teams which we most want to encourage to use the dashboard. We've given presentations to different teams many times. We've presented at an all-staff event and many of these sort of things. And just whenever we receive a question which can be answered by pointing somebody to the dashboard, we do this, and this usually gets people using it a bit more frequently. Okay, so in terms of evaluating the work at the end, so the dashboard's had around 65,000 views in the first year. We're a very small organisation, so this is pretty good for us. We had around 300 pieces of media coverage. In terms of the initial goals, we've been able to answer around 1 in 3 data requests we've received since launch, at least in part through the dashboard. It's informed policy papers, the organisation, and parliamentary debates have referenced the data from the dashboard. It's been publicly praised by various researchers and clinicians. The Guardian article on the previous page had some quotes from various researchers. And we continue to update it after launch. So we're adding in another year's data every year, where we've added an extra page since the initial launch and added extra filters to some pages. And we monitor the feedback form, as I say. The percentages at the top are the feedback from the feedback form, which is all positive so far, which is nice. And we won this Trustworthiness, Quality and Value Award for the work last year. Okay, thank you.
Elliot, thank you very much indeed. Just a reminder to those of you online and indeed in the room, if you want to use the Slido, it's bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. Let's start with questions in the room. Plenty to dig into there, I think. Who wants to go first? Got down the front.
Hi, Paul Atherton. I'm going to be a filmmaker this time because that's what I do. I was really interested in that sort of fair group. I don't know how much you've sort of dived into it, but what is it that people feel is currently lacking? Is there a trend within that group, or?
So when we were doing reviews initially, there was when we were doing the user testing process, there was quite a lot of requests for extra data, but it was, as I say earlier, like very specific things generally. We've covered the broad strokes in the dashboard, but there's like, if people are pursuing a very specific like treatment path, then they may want more information on that specific treatment path. But if it's not that common, it's quite hard to include it in this sort of context.
Thanks. Who wants to go next? We've got one down at the front. We'll come to the back next.
Hi, Claire Griffiths, Department of Health and Social Care. Just wondering how you find maintaining the dashboard. I think we've kind of found with this sort of thing, building it is one thing, but keeping it maintained can be quite a job of work.
We don't find it too difficult so far. So far, so good. So like the annual updates. So we, as I mentioned, we do an annual publication with general trends. We've been trying to time the annual update of the dashboard with our annual trends publication. So we're sort of doing the work anyway for that to like prepare the data anyway. So we're able to combine it with that. So it's naturally, like I think last year is the first time we did the update, and I think it was like 2 days work sort of thing. It's not too bad for the impact.
Thanks. So we had a question right at the back, and I'll come to you next.
Hi, my name is Gareth Hobbs. I just was interested in terms of the users that were accessing the dashboard. What was the kind of distribution of who was using it? Was it different people than you first expected, or was it as you expected?
So we don't have too much information on this, unfortunately. The 65,000 numbers is from a Google Analytics thing. It doesn't tell you anything too specific. I know that I've had individual experiences of speaking to people in the sector who've referenced that they've used it, but that's like a sample size of 5. So I feel like this is the wrong context to throw that sort of thing around. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, Liz Lichtendorf. Was there anything politically difficult to publish? Because I have no desire to have children, so it's not really my issue. But if I interpreted the data correctly, you probably need 4 rounds of treatment to have a successful birth. That seems like a terrifying statistic, given kind of costs and all of the medical jazz that goes with it.
This is our remit is very specific. We we publish data. The guidelines on what treatment people need, that's done by NICE, National Institute for Care something, and that's their responsibility, I'm afraid. So I'm going to avoid the question.
Excellent. Who wants to go next? We've got one right there, and we'll come to you next.
Thanks. Philip Nye from the Institute for Government. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the technology that you've used for both the front end and the back end, and any constraints that you found in working with that.
Okay. The back end for this is the data's all stored in SQL databases and this sort of thing. The front end stuff is just Power BI. It's Microsoft software. It's publicly, it's not public. They have a free version and a paid version, but the paid version is very cheap. That, I think, was a big part of the appeal for this. It's very cheap and relatively simple to learn how to use.
Thanks. And we'll go there next, and we'll come you next.
Thank you for the talk. Ignacio Castro from Queen Mary University of London. I was wondering, connecting it to the previous talk, what is the cost of doing this? And by the way, I obviously know that you cannot tell me the budget, but what's the overhead? How many people do you need to create it, maintain it, and whether there are economies of scale? So if this was just a unit of the government and you would have to do this for another 100 units, what's the overhead? How does it look like?
So we are a tiny organisation, so the full organisation is 70, 75 people. In terms of the team working on this, it was me, one other person, and then occasionally we had a third. And we were doing other work at the same time, and it was about a year end to end for us. So it was, in the scheme of government projects, it wasn't the most expensive thing in the world.
Thanks.
Hiya, Alex Blanford, University of Oxford again. Things like this are really interesting foundational data that sometimes, and I think we'll probably get onto this with Andy's talk, get sort of political layering put on top of it. Have you had any interaction with other organisations that want to take your data and mash it together with other things to create more of a narrative that goes beyond the raw numbers and that lets people make decisions or do something with the data?
Okay. So we do, in terms of combining data sets, I think I'm right in saying our data is like legally separate. We're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to do that sort of data sharing for legal reasons because it's a very sensitive area. In terms of using the data for other reasons, so we do we have a policy team. We do try to get data into their work as much as possible. We have some contact with the Department of Health, and I know that they have used data from this before. It has. There was a time very early on after the launch when the dashboard got a specific name check in the Senate, and I was very happy with myself in that moment. So yeah, it is out there getting used. I don't necessarily see all of it, but I know that it is out there.
Thanks. Let's take another question in the room. Any more questions in the room? Because it seems that there's a lot of user research and a lot of user engagement that's gone into that project with a very small team, and not just in terms of the dashboard, but helping people to understand how to use it and navigate it. And it's obviously a very sensitive area as well. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you approach that and what you might say to other organisations who are looking to bring users into some of these conversations.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, our biggest difficulty with user testing stuff was we sort of initially didn't anticipate quite how much we would end up doing. We had some idea that we would need to do some, but we didn't. It ended up being a much bigger process than we expected. I think preparing for that and properly considering who needs to be involved in this from the beginning is important, and something we have learned the lesson around now. We have more projects, and there's a lot more user testing being planned for these things now.
Excellent. We've got time for a final quick question, if somebody wants to squeeze in a very quick final one. No. Otherwise, that probably brings us to a very nice conclusion. Elliot, thank you very much indeed. And our third speaker tonight is Amanda.
I'm going to be talking about data service standards. And firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge that this is work I've been doing for 2 years, but with all of these amazing women, Jenny, Heidi, Mathilde, Angie, Ignacia, and Anna Powell. And this work has been with cities across North, Central, and South America, predominantly cities who are managing things like open data portals, just to give you a bit of context. So, a data service standard, we define this as explaining what good looks like when you're designing, developing, and implementing a high-quality data and analytics service. And as you might imagine, we've borrowed heavily from the original digital service standards and the UK service standards in thinking about how to put this approach to data. And this is what it looks like. So this is the sample data service standard that we came up with 3 years ago now. It's available completely openly in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese. And what you can see here are the kind of different principles or points of the standard. So, for example, publishing with purpose, solving a whole problem for users, inspiring data users. And then within each point of the standard, you've got why it's important and what it means. So essentially, it's more like a policy rather than a technical standard. So if we say a standard is an agreed and documented way of doing something, and a data standard is a bit more specific, like the open contracting standard, then these are holistic. They're ways of working. They're defining what good looks like, but trying to stop what bad looks like in a context. And we think of them as a very cheap and powerful lever that can change and align behaviour. But even more importantly, it's about trying to really symbolise your intent to raise the bar, to systematise very good practice, and then to scale knowledge and communities, and to try to make these as open as possible. But a really good data service standard can't just be the points themselves. It also needs guidance that will support how teams do it, so they can look at that guidance and implement it themselves. Governance that will incentivise its use and adoption, and we've seen different models of governance in different cities, which I can talk about. And you also need a team who are going to design the standard, but also run it on the day-to-day. And these are just some of the standards that have been published over the last couple of years from Arlington, Scottsdale, Maipu, and Guadalajara. And what we've really learned over the last couple of years is that to really make a good standard, you want to make sure it's unique. So it needs to be really tailored to the local context, whether that's your city or the sector you're working in. You want it to be measurable. You want it to be simple, practical, but also aspirational. And most importantly, you want it to be flexible, because as we know, our standards are changing all the time. Our approach to technology is changing. Our approach to data and ethics and what we deem ethical changes over time. So you want to allow for that flexibility. But generally speaking, if you're creating a standard, these are the kind of 6 things you want to have in your mind. So I'm just going to pull out some examples from some of my favourite standards and some of their points, which I love. So this is from Arlington in Texas, and they were the first city to publish a data service standard openly. And you'll see in the very first point of their standard, it's all about having a multidisciplinary team who really have that overview for looking after services. So they have a data governance group, and that's embedded right from the start. So they will review any potential new data services that are being built in the city. And that group is made up of 34 different people from different departments, different professions. And whenever any city member is making analytics now in the city of Arlington, then it must be reviewed by both technical experts and non-technical experts. So having people from legal teams, policy and procurement involved in the design and delivery of data services. And this one was particularly interesting for us because the folks who made the standard in the city were from the data team, but also the comms team. They worked hand in hand right from the beginning and really articulate they had a shared goal, which was to make information available for everybody. And from most of the cities we've worked with, they've often articulated that comms is someone they speak to at the end. They're scared things won't go through, but by bringing them from the beginning, they were able to create the standard together. Another favourite example of mine is Irvine in Texas. So one of their points of their standard is about understanding users and their needs. This is when I get really geeky, but you can see in the guidance for developers, they've got a section that's all about determining how data should be made available based on your end user needs. So when they're developing data services now, they're really thinking about the granularity of data, the frequency of updates, and the type of service that's being provided. And the thing that makes me really geeky and really excited is this part that says, will the data service alone meet the end user needs goals? So when they're building things, they're really thinking about, is a CSV enough? Is an API enough? Or actually, do we need to build an analytics service on top, like a map or visualization for other people to understand? So they're really threading through that user need and that user testing before they even build data services. So a couple more. This is from Rochester in New York, and one of the points in their standard is be strategic when choosing technology. You might think, oh my gosh, that's really vague. Do not worry, there's lots of lovely detail. So they've included things like understanding the total cost of ownership before you even build a data service, evaluating the impact of your dependencies, particularly because lots of cities have portals that are run by external companies. They want to make sure they're building things as future-proofed as they can. And then to continually assess your technology choices, so adapting those based on service requirements and industry standards. And it's probably no surprise that they had a really good, heavy tech influence in developing their standard from their tech teams. Chattanooga in Tennessee, in one of the points of their data service standard, they included points around performance evaluation. So when they're building data services now, they always have to identify metrics up front and commit to doing user research, and then really thinking about creating a culture of evaluation. And that's then supported by all this guidance to help the teams understand what that means in practice. And then just a final one from one of the other cities. This is Maipu in Chile. Again, really exciting because this is the second data service standard that was published first in Spanish in a LATAM region. And so what you're seeing here is a point around forming multidisciplinary and transversal teams. What that means in practice is that in the city of Maipu, they don't really have a lot of developers in-house. They don't have user researchers or service designers. A lot of the time they're partnering with contractors or building those skills in. And so their standard really sets the expectation that data services will be built in partnership, that they'll have the funding for those people and they'll work together as one team. So just 3 final observations about data service standards. Creating them and improving them should be a team sport. These work really well when you're doing them as a data community of practice and you're bringing together different teams and different professions right from the start. Assessments-wise, what's worked for the original digital service standard probably won't work for data services yet, and I can talk more about that. And then the final point really is to always review things, to review and refine your data service standard based on what you're learning from every data service. So when we work with cities, we recommend that as soon as they've got their standard, they then think really closely about the next 3 data services they're building. So testing this with a brand new kind of greenfield service, something completely old, and refining it, but then also working with different departments who have different levels of funding and skills to see if this works across their region. So if you're thinking about doing a data service standard, then the kind of 2 questions I always ask people to think about is what is one bad data behaviour that you'd like to reduce or stop, and what is one good data behaviour you'd like to continue or encourage? And that's me at time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Amanda.
you.
A reminder that to get to the Slido, it's bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. Who wants to go first? First question. We've got one there, and we'll come to you next.
Thanks, Matt Curler from the Vatnik School of Government. Really, really interesting. Previously had a life as a civil servant, as an analyst, and butted up against sort of the GDS service standard a couple of times. So I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about assessment particularly, and about the fact that sort of, we now live in this world where there's this increasing expectation that data is digital and it's online and it's available, but actually the things that have been done for digital government and public services are very transactional. Yes. And data services are different. Yes, there's a transactional bit where I want to get a bit of data, but there's also, I want a map. And the design system doesn't help you build maps. Yeah. So I thought, it'd just be interesting to sort of, how does this mesh with that sort of existing sort of digital government approach that I think obviously they're still embedding for that, but it's much more established.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. So firstly, in terms of different skills and capability, the cities we're working with, it's really wide-ranging. So you might have some who only put out data services. You might have some who have the capability to make those maps and visualizations. You might have some who can do lots of user research and lots of user testing to see what works really well. I think the point around assessments is really being pragmatic in this space. And I speak as someone who used to run a digital service, and I think about, one, the kind of team I had and the skills I had, but also it became such an industry towards the end that it even switched a lot of us off from doing those kinds of service assessments. And so I think when you're talking about these data teams, very often in cities, it's 1 or 2 people performing so many different roles. We want to be really pragmatic in helping them think through what is the right way to assess it against the standard. And at the moment, most cities will have this as part of their governance group. They'll show a plan for a plan. They'll go through each point and try to bring together those different skills. But it is about being really pragmatic and starting from where you are and trying to build the expertise and the case for investing in that.
Thanks. We had a question, the row in front, and I'll come to the back next.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Anna Goss from FF Studio. Hi, Amanda. I was going to ask about assessments, but I feel like that ship maybe has sailed. So instead, I thought I might ask if you have got any favourite stories about data services that have like improved or changed, or like behaviours that you've seen shift since you've worked with some of these cities and introduced the data standards?
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's the thing that's always surprised me so much is so many of the data teams are just often a kind of afterthought. And I speak as someone who used to run data services myself, in that they're commissioned by policy, they're commissioned by senior executive teams to just build a dashboard, and they very rarely get the chance to do user testing or user research with communities, which is why it's so great to hear the previous story. And I think there was one city I was working with who I can't name check, but they were building a service that was all around compliance and regulation around short-term rentals, and just seeing them doing user testing for the first time with communities who weren't as digitally literate, and they were able to then adapt their map designs, their content design based on what they were seeing firsthand. That's the stuff that really excites me, because they so often don't get the expertise or the time to be able to do that kind of user testing and real life testing. So for them, they just felt really empowered to be thought of and to be able to learn in that new way.
Thanks. Next question is in the corner at the back, and then I will come to the next two. Could you just wait for the mic, Harry?
Oh, Harry, you do need a mic for those at home. I know.
All right, I'll use my indoor voice. Harry Harold, Neon Tribe. What does the word transversal mean in that context? Because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so transversal will just mean across public sector and private sector. So essentially it's building teams that are of the government, so public sector workers, but also external private sector workers as well. So it's just trying to bridge those two worlds. Thank you for asking.
Cool, thank you. We had a hand there, and then we'll go to Alex.
Hello, it's Daniel speaking. I work in web scraping. And actually, your experience is very interesting to me, because I know a lot of private companies do collect data from the web directly. And I was wondering if this happens as well across various cities, because, you know, the paradox is there is a lot of data, but it's very difficult to access and to process. And this can be game-changing for governments because they have limited funding. And they can actually process a lot of data by using this capability. So I was wondering if you've ever seen this type of approach.
Yeah, definitely. So we've definitely seen private sector companies who have been scraping and reusing a lot of the open data from cities. I think the thing that is also interesting to me is to think about the reverse of that. So there are certain cities who have got lots of funding available who can buy data sets, so are buying data from Google or Waze and being able to kind of bolster their own data ecosystem. That is still really unequal across different cities across the Americas, but even here in the UK as well. So yes, we're seeing private sector companies doing that scraping, but also we're seeing an increase in cities now buying more data, doing more data brokerage to try to increase the data they have as well.
Thanks. There, back in the corner.
Alex, decloaking as public digital rather than the University of Oxford. You mentioned unique as one of the things that this needs to be. How do you balance between meeting local needs, local specificity, and like making the standards, I assume, consistently interoperable across like, you know, if you're going for different cities in Texas, presumably you want the data to probably interoperate between cities and to be the ethos to be sufficiently similar. And so how do you manage to balance individuated needs with repeatability and standardization?
Yeah, ideally you do. And I think when I first started working with cities, I probably went into it quite naively, thinking that there was a lot of interoperability and thinking that these places in these big geographies had the same kind of approach and collected the same kind of things. It is really, really rare. And I think what we've always tried to encourage with the standard is that simplicity and that flexibility. You'll see a lot of common points around user research and around security. You know, there's not a lot of difference in the points themselves. What we do see is a difference in how cities approach it. So they'll call out particular communities to partner with or particular tech they're using, but that difference is always going to be there, and it is tricky. And this model we've not done it at that federal level or that central level in those cities. For me, I'd be interested now to test it in that different level of geography to see if it makes a difference.
I'll squeeze in a final quick question.
David Durant again. You mentioned that a lot of these places have very few people doing this work. I wonder if there've been opportunities for them to help each other out.
Yeah, there are really strong data communities of practice across all these cities, and there are fantastic programs that convene a lot of these cities to learn from each other. So not just across English-speaking American cities, but also across the broader LATAM regions as well. So I think because of the scarcity of people doing this kind of work, it has driven more communities. And even when I was doing this work as well, I felt that. So it's absolutely fundamental for it.
Great note on which to end.
Thank
Amanda,
you.
thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
And I think this may be the longest gap between two Data Bytes presentations from the same person. So welcome back to Data Bytes, Andy.
Hey folks, it's me, it's Andy. It's been, Data Bytes 3 was a long, long time ago. I was talking about the idea of interoperability of government data 6 years ago. We've got it, right? We've done it. Whoop, whoop. Since then, I have moved to work for Full Fact. So can I just get a quick show of hands? How many people in the room have heard of Full Fact? Oh, you are my people. Thank you very much. Love this room. Don't need to talk too much about who Full Fact are, but I will just do a little quick tour of who we are. So Full Fact, we're a fact-checking organisation. We're an independent organisation. We're a charity with a cross-party set of trustees who govern our work. And we fact-check information that we see online. And we're also a team of technologists, and I'm talking a little bit about what that looks like from the technology side because my job title is pretty cool, Head of AI for Full Fact, a lot of excitement in there. And we try to use technology to support the processes of fact-checking. And we do that for our fact-checkers based in the UK, and we also do that for fact-checkers around the world. So this map on the right-hand side here is where fact-checking organisations use the technology that we built in Full Fact. And you see quite a lot of organisations in Africa and across the Middle East are working in that. And that means we've been using AI in some quite challenging environments. We've been using it in South Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo. Interesting and very difficult, challenging environments. And there's a whole other talk I'll do one day about the use of AI and the fact that it can be quite practical in this thing of just helping people workflow efficiencies, not the most sophisticated AI you'll ever seen, but stuff that works and makes a difference and helps people in the work that they're undertaking. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the fact that bad information hurts democracy. As Gavin said before, I like to have slides with big sweeping statements on them. And so we could spend a long time trying to unpack this. But I think about bad information it can be in the individual things, but it can be stuff that stacks up. And I mean, bad information can hurt democracy in terms of if people decide that they don't trust the process of democracy or it is pointless voting, you start to get some very dire consequences. And so fact-checking sometimes can be seen as sort of the triviality of the small statements. And I think of it as being the small statements that build up to the big statements that can be about opinions and processes that affect at a very societal level. And so I'm a bit biased, obviously. I work for a fact-checker. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think fact checks are just a really interesting piece of content and how they fit into the web, because I absolutely love talking about the web. And so a fact check. For a long time, fact checks are 600 to 800 words, and they're published on websites. And there are fact checkers around the world, and we talk about independent fact checkers. These are people who are accredited fact checkers. We have to go through a process where we're accredited and allowed to be a fact checker, and we publish this content. And there's normally a specific claim, and there's a conclusion that we come to, and there's a bunch of working out that goes into that. And the idea of a fact check is it's something that you can follow along at home. We are not telling you what to think. We are saying, here is a conclusion that someone has come to. Here's how we came to that conclusion. You can check it all out yourself. You don't have to believe what we're saying, but this is the best of our abilities. But also, because of the beautiful thing that is the web, those fact checks don't just get published on our website. They go into lots of different places as well. And that's because of the wonderful world of open standards. So every fact check that is written by Full Fact, we also have a JSON sidecar that goes alongside that where we have a bunch of metadata. And we follow a schema standard. It's called claim review. And this is the recognized standard for how content can move around associated to fact checkers. And that means that on a Google search result, fact checks appear as a slightly different content type. It's quite subtle, but rather than a normal SERP that you might see, there's a specific piece of information here. So there's a claim, who made that claim, and a fact check. And so we can see that it's being checked by somebody. And that just helps us in the way that we appear quite high in the rankings, and also just shows that it's slightly different content types. And also the same kind of thing happens on YouTube, and the same kind of thing happens on Meta products as well. So there's this kind of interface where fact checks appear into these other content surfaces. And I think that's really interesting for us because fact checks get seen by a lot of people. In the work that we do, we have a number of people who come to our website, and that's fantastic. But the vast majority of people who consume our content are doing so off-platform. They're doing it on other people's surfaces. And large tech companies aren't great about giving really granular information about how their products are used. But from Meta's point of view, they publish some open numbers as part of the Digital Services Act in Europe, hundreds of millions of times. Google products, the last time they published some numbers about fact checks, billions of times fact checks are seen across these surfaces. And I think that's really interesting because it's about data. It's about how the data moves around, and we are publishing data with our own descriptions, and that it's been used by platforms and services in different ways that we don't always totally get to control. So, of course, because I'm a nerd, I didn't say that at the start, but it's probably all assumed, right? I think about this stuff quite a lot. I've been thinking about how to approach what that could look like with more detail. And so I've been working with a bunch of fact checkers around the world on a different schema for what information could look like. And in the sort of teal group we have on one side here is the information we broadly capture, but we've been trying to do some more enrichment of that. And so now when you look at full fact checks, and if you look at the source, you'll see that we use Wikidata identifiers all through our work. So we're not talking about sort of just names, we're talking about specific things. We include the Wikidata IDs, so you have a very good canonical representation of information. And we started to think about also the fact that not every fact check is equal. Some fact checks are about different people and have different levels of harm inside them. And we've been starting to think about how do you take something that could be quite subjective, the concept of harm, and try to codify that into our work. We're doing some work with other fact checkers and some academics at Westminster University to think about what this could look like, about the idea of can we train and come to a consensus about the idea of how to capture things, about how harmful something is, how far it might spread, what kind of distortion is it, and what was the reason why someone was pushing this information? What were they trying to achieve in the world? Were they trying to get famous? Were they trying to change who you vote for? Were they trying to scam you out of money? And I think it's super interesting to think about what this stuff looks like, and also particularly what this looks like in a world where a lot of people are taking this content and training AI models from it. This is good canonical information that looks something close to the truth. Obviously, there are lots of other ways. People talk about this stuff a lot at the moment. There's the concept of community notes. We know that Twitter X use community notes, and we know that Meta are rolling out community notes in the US at some stage this year. Community notes, I think, are a brilliant thing. They can be really, really powerful, and the idea of sourcing stuff up from the crowd is a really useful thing. But also, I think fact checks are quite an important part of that. Maldita, an amazing fact checker based in Spain, did a bit of analysis of the domains that we used within community notes. And the top was X itself, but Wikipedia was second, and then fact checks were third in that list. And I think that's interesting because Wikipedia has 60 million or so pages. There are about 200,000 fact checks ever written. So in terms of their importance, they're sort of over-indexing in this world of information here. And so I think there is definitely something to be said for making sure that community notes and fact checks sit alongside each other. So I've been thinking about the fact that this is a web scale issue. There is a small number of fact checks, and I'm thinking about how do we describe that? How do we give the best information so those can be utilized by as many people as possible, as many products as possible, as much AI as possible? And I've got a data set, and I'm trying to work out who wants to talk to me about this data set. I've got some annotations of fact checks. I've got about 1,000 fact checks written by a globally representative group of people that have been really detailed annotations against them to try and make the most useful utility of data that we possibly have. And I'd love to chat to you. This is not my main thing, but this is just something I'm doing, a part of my work of just thinking about how can we make our content as useful as possible and do as much as we possibly can. So if you want to chat, my email address is pretty easy to work out. Drop me a mail, and I'd love to talk to you more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. A reminder, as if you need it by now, Slido is bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. Let's start in the room. First question to Andy. We've got one right down at the front.
Thanks, that was absolutely fascinating and obviously really, really important. When you were showing us the Google search result, whether about cats in Scotland, I wanted to ask the question: how is it that Full Fact is the authoritative fact checker there? Like, how is that managed? How do you become a fact checker? And could a bad actor come in and claim to be a fact checker and check the facts differently?
Sure, it's a really good question. So the idea of being an independent fact checker is we are verified by an organisation that's called the International Fact Checking Network. And to be a member of that network, you need to be audited, and that happens every 2 years. And that auditing process is to check samples of our work, is to check our funding, is to understand if we have any political funding that sits behind us. Fact checking has to be neutral. And we're reviewed, 2 blind reviews are a part of that process as well. And so by being a verified member of a fact checking network is something that one of the platforms takes seriously as, okay, these people are legitimate. And so anybody could use the markup that we use. It is JSON. You could make your own blog and write fact checks and use that description. It's up to platforms to make that choice about what they trust and what they don't. And at the moment, that independent accreditation is the system that is used.
Thanks. We've got a question there and then a question there.
Thank you for the very cool presentation. Ignacio Castro from Queen Mary University. You were talking about your use of AI to augment your ability to do fact-checking. Can you expand a little bit more on that? How much more can you do thanks to AI?
Sure. So to be very clear to start with, we do not use AI to do fact-checking. That would, I think, clearly be a very bad idea. But what we do, but we use AI to principally help us identify the most important things to fact check each day. And so this is a web scale monitoring problem. So we built tooling around various models that take a large amount of content, basically anything that is written or is spoken or there are pictures on the internet. We take that and we run that through a bunch of models where we do some semantic enrichment, but also we use models to identify harm. And so we can start to produce triage lists of what look like the most important things to check. And we can also use a bunch of different techniques around, a lot of it vector-based, to understand where people are repeating things that have previously been checked. So we can build this kind of global view of what misinformation looks like. And that helps us be more focused about where we're making our interventions, because we are monitoring, in the UK, I would say there's probably 100,000 things that we detect that we could fact check each day. And we have 12 fact checkers. So that triage process is incredibly important, and technology is really, really helpful as part of that.
Thanks. Then we had a question there. I'll come to the back row next.
Hello, David Durant again. When you mentioned that Google was doing those billions and billions of checks, I presume that's not running through a bunch of servers that belongs to Full Fact. So you're providing data to Google, and then Google's doing some kind of processing using your data. How do we know that their processing is accurate? Because you're saying that the Full Fact data is right, but how do we know what they're doing is right? And connected to that, if I'm an organisation without much money, if I'm like Blue Sky, and I decide I want to add fact-checking into what I'm doing, how would I, build on the data that you give me?
Sure. So 2 really good questions there. So how platforms use our data is not something that we can totally control. And so I'm obsessed with the idea of things like machine-readable context and caveats that go alongside things. And part of the reason for this idea of an expansion of metadata to sit around things is to pass as much information with the fact check as possible so that people can reuse it. I want people to read this content. I want to be a good citizen and provide the right information. And at times we've seen that platforms don't always get this right. We certainly saw that during the pandemic, where we were writing fact checks about whether the pandemic started from a lab in China. And so we put out a fact check that's saying, actually, it's quite complicated and there's a lot that is unknown about this at the moment. And Meta quite zealously took that and started applying it to anybody who ever mentioned this as a theory. And we're saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We said it's complicated. Stop saying if things are right or wrong. And Meta's processes have improved hugely since then. But it is part of the web that I think is really interesting, of trying to ensure that good information is enterprise scale, but we don't lose the subtlety of it, because often when we're writing a fact check, it is not yes, no, black, white. It's very often, annoyingly, pedantically, it's complicated, and we want to ensure that that travels with our work. And I'm sorry, I forgot you had 2 questions, and I just went on the first one.
I think we had a question over at the back the other way first, and then we'll come that way next. There was a hand up there, I think.
Hi there. I was quickly going to say, how much busier has the Trump administration kept you?
I mean, I think Gavin showed a picture at the start, which was me 6 years ago before I started in fact-checking. I think that kind of told its own story. I think we're living in really challenging times, and I think the only thing I would say on the Trump administration is, I am apolitical as a fact-checker. I am not here to talk sides, but I do think it is important that we can all agree on the idea that facts are important and that they exist. And I think facts are not opinions, and it's pretty important that we hold our ground on that. That is not a radical concept, but I'm increasingly finding that I somehow now work for a radical organisation, and that is not what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think my question's in a similar vein, Harry from DXW. What's the future? How's this going to unfold over the next year or so? I know I'm not asking for a crystal ball view, but just your instinct with Meta moving to community notes, with the rise of this rather odd way of thinking on the other side of the Atlantic. What do you think is going to happen next? I
mean, it's a really relevant and important question to ask, I think. I expect the community notes projects will do relatively well. I think they will be important. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens at meta level scale when it comes to this. I mean, their products are used by just so many people that the kind of consensus that is needed for community notes to work, an agreement on something about how often they do get utilized. But what I think we will see and continue to see, as I showed in one of my slides, is that for things like community notes to work, they need to happen alongside expert views as well. Obviously, I think fact checks are part of that expert view, but experts is a broad category, and I think we will see, hopefully, a kind of an adjustment to ensure that expert voices are included in that, and an understanding that if something is an ideological issue and you're asking a community to agree whether something is right or wrong before it is shown to users, you're not going to get much traction. But when you start to bring in factual information and we can maintain that agreement that that exists, I believe that that will be really powerful. And we will wait and see what Meta do with their community notes. I would expect, with no intelligence at all from the inside, that it will be different from how X have approached it. And I think it will become part of our nomenclature that we'll just have to be talking about specific platforms' approaches to community notes rather than it being a general concept like a Wikipedia or the similar.
I'm going to take a very quick question from the front.
Thanks. Paul Atherton, this time with my Museum of Homelessness hat on. I am fascinated. How do you address the issue of having a problem with facts within a fact? So just very quickly, the welfare figure is bandied around, but actually often what they're talking about is like 1% of the welfare. When they say we're going to cut the welfare budget, they're actually only going after unemployment. And I'm just curious, is there a way of addressing that bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the deep challenges of fact-checking is that fact-checking often deals with a specific claim, so that's one piece of information, but often that will be part of a narrative or a story or a bigger picture. And a lot of the time when we're writing stuff in full fact, usually it's maybe the third paragraph of a fact check will say why we've written something. It will often be something along the lines, this is an example of this style of statistical representation, and here is a little kind of explainer about what that looks like, and here are other examples of it. And I think that route from canonical small pieces of information to the narratives they fit into, and then ultimately what needs to change to stop the bad information existing, be that changes to platform policies, be changes to legislation, be changes to the way that some official statistics are described. Those things all have to happen, and I think fact-checking is in a sort of a librarian role, but also it is about change. It's about being kind of bold enough to say, well, we think that something is not good enough and there needs to be improvements about the way it's described, because if it carries on, people will have that misrepresentation. And from the point of view when we're writing, we're always trying to take the view of what would the average person think when they're consuming this? And if something is technically, semantically correct, but most people won't understand that, we will take the view of that still isn't good enough.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that for those of you in the room, I'm the only thing standing between you and the drinks that will soon appear at the back of the room, so I'll keep the parish notices short. You can watch this event back as live on YouTube or Slido. It's bit.ly/databytes53, all lowercase. There will be a blog post and audio to follow where we will include as many of the slides as possible as well. Please do share those with your friends, especially those working in the public sector. The next Data Bites will be on Thursday, the 3rd of April. If you do want to get in touch with speaker offers or suggestions, you can come and speak to me afterwards or email us events@public.digital. All that remains for me to say are some very big thank yous. First of all, to PD for hosting, to all of you for coming and some brilliant questions this evening, online and here in the room. And join me in thanking our 4 brilliant speakers this evening. I think quite different perspectives, presentations, but a lot of commonalities when it came to standards and thinking about data as a service, thinking about users, thinking about maintenance and future-proofing. And I thought as well, working in the open was a key theme that spanned all 4. So a huge thank you to Duncan, Elliot, Amanda and Andy. Thank you very much.